The ship had no weapons, and that was the whole point. Ambassador Ilara Mwangi stood at the observation deck of the outstretched hand and watched the stars slide past like diamonds scattered on black velvet. She had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, and now that it was here, she felt a strange calm settle over her bones, like snow on a quiet field. Behind her stood 12 members of her delegation, scientists and artists and musicians and historians, each one chosen not for their ability to fight, but for their ability to represent everything beautiful about the human race. They carried with them a single data crystal containing the complete cultural archive of Earth. Every song ever recorded, every painting ever preserved, every poem and novel and symphony and lullaby that had survived the long march of human history. It was the most precious object any of them had ever held, and Ilara intended to give it away freely as a gift. The United Earth Confederacy had discovered faster than light travel only 30 years ago, and in that short time, humanity had learned a terrible truth. The galaxy was not empty. It was full of life. Thousands of species spread across millions of worlds, and all of them answered to the Galactic Council, a governing body that had ruled the Orion Arm for over 200,000 years. It was older than human civilization by a factor that made the mind ache. And humanity was nothing to it. The Council had classified Earth as a Class 12 primitive world, barely worth noticing and certainly not worth respecting. The designation meant that humans were considered too young and too violent and too small to participate in galactic affairs. They were allowed to exist, but only in the way that insects are allowed to exist, ignored until they become a nuisance. Ilara intended to change that. The outstretched hand dropped out of FTL above the Council homeworld of Aethara, and the sight of it stole the breath from every human on board. The planet was enormous, 3 times the size of Earth, and it glowed with the light of 10 billion structures built across its surface. Orbital rings wrapped around it like halos, and ships moved through its atmosphere like schools of silver fish. It was the center of galactic civilization, and it made Earth look like a village. They were met by an escort of Council security vessels that scanned them and prodded them, and treated them the way a hospital treats a patient suspected of carrying a disease. The outstretched hand was unarmed and unshielded, and the escort ships did not bother to hide their contempt. Ilara did not care. She had not come to impress. She had come to speak. The Council chamber was a vast cathedral of light and stone, carved into the heart of Aethara itself. Thousands of representatives from thousands of species filled the tiered seats that rose in every direction, like the inside of a living throat platform, a disk of polished metal that floated above a bottomless shaft, and Ilara walked onto it without hesitation. She looked up at the faces staring down at her. Some were curious, some were bored, most were indifferent. But in the highest tier, she saw the delegation of the Veilith hegemony, tall reptilian figures with scales the color of dried blood, and eyes like molten copper. They controlled the Council through centuries of political manipulation and economic pressure, and their High Arbiter Thalvex sat at the center of them, like a king on a throne of bones. He looked at Ilara the way a predator looks at something too small to eat. She began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the chamber like a bell struck in silence. She spoke of Earth and its history, not the wars and the conquests that the Council had used to label humanity dangerous, but the other things, the music that humans made when they were sad, the art they created when they were bored, lonely, the way they held each other during storms and sang to their children in the dark. She spoke of Shakespeare and Beethoven, and the woman who had first planted rice in a flooded field 10,000 years ago. She spoke of astronauts who wept when they saw the Earth from space, and doctors who worked through the night to save a stranger. She held up the data crystal, and it caught the light of the chamber like a small star. "This is everything we are," she said. "Every song and every story and every dream we have ever had. We give it to you freely, because we believe that the sharing of who we are is the first step toward understanding. And understanding is the first step toward peace." Several smaller species in the lower tiers shifted in their seats. Something in Ilara's words had touched them, a frequency that resonated with their own loneliness in the vast machine of the council. The Rithani Collective's elder representative leaned forward with wide dark eyes and something more, like hope on his ancient face. But in the highest tier, Thalvex did not move. His copper eyes were fixed on Ilara, with the flat patience of a creature that had already decided what it was going to do. The vote happened behind closed doors. Thalvex presented his case with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been destroying civilizations through paperwork for longer than humanity had existed. He cited Earth's history of wars and genocides and weapons development. He referenced the nuclear arsenals and the biological research programs and the long bloody record of a species that could not stop killing even itself. He invoked the doctrine of preemptive containment, a council law that allowed for the neutralization of species deemed to be existential threats before they became powerful enough to act. The vote was 7-5 in favor of containment. The Rithani elder voted against it. He argued and pleaded and warned them that this was a mistake, was drowned by the weight of Valeth influence and the fear that Thalvex had so carefully cultivated. They came for Ilara in the night. Her delegation was seized in their quarters. The scientists and the artists and the musicians dragged from their beds by council security forces. The data crystal was confiscated. The outstretched hand was impounded. Ilara was brought before the full council chamber in restraints, and the holocams were activated because Thalvex wanted the galaxy to see what happened to primitive species that forgot their place. The chamber was full again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of a crowd watching an execution. Ilara stood on the speaking platform, with her hands bound behind her back. Her face was bruised and her uniform was torn, but her eyes were steady and clear. She looked up at the tiers of alien faces, and then she looked directly into the holocam, the one that was broadcasting live to every corner of the galaxy, including a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star. She did not beg. She did not scream. She did not curse. She spoke 7 words in a voice so calm it made the Rithani elder close his eyes in grief. "Earth will remember what you did here." Thalvex gave the order. The neural dissolution beam activated, and Ilara Mwangi's body came apart like light breaking through a prism, painless and instant and absolute. One moment she was there, and the next she was nothing but a fading warmth in the air where she had stood. Thalvex stepped down from his tier and walked to the speaking platform. He picked up the data crystal, the one that held every song and story and dream of the human race, and he crushed it beneath his clawed foot. The fragments scattered across the polished metal like broken stars. He turned to the holocam and smiled. "Let the record show," he said, "that the matter of the human species has been resolved." In the lower tiers, the Rithani elder sat with his head in his hands and whispered to his aide in a voice that trembled with something that was not grief, but fear. "You fools," he said, "you broke the one species in the galaxy that doesn't know how to stop once it starts." Across the galaxy, the holocam feed reached Earth, and Earth went quiet. Span style incorrect. The feed played on every screen on Earth at the same time. In Tokyo, a man stopped in the middle of a crosswalk and stared up at the massive public display mounted on the side of a skyscraper. In Lagos, a mother covered her daughter's eyes and then uncovered them because she decided that her child needed to see what the galaxy truly was. In Buenos Aires, An old soldier who had fought in 3 wars sat down on a park bench and watched the light leave Elara Mwangi's body. And he did not cry, because he had run out of tears decades ago. But something behind his ribs turned to iron and stayed that way. The world did not scream. That was the part that frightened the galactic intelligence agencies the most. Every species they had ever contained or conquered or broken had reacted the same way, with panic and rage and desperate flailing. Transmissions would flood the networks full of threats and weeping and pleas for mercy. The species would fracture and turn on itself, and the Council would simply wait for the pieces to stop moving. Earth did none of these things. For 3 days the planet was silent. No transmissions left the solar system. No signals were broadcast on any frequency. No human voice reached the galactic network. It was as if the entire species had drawn a single breath and held it. On the Council homeworld of Aethara, the intelligence services of 14 different species scrambled to understand what was happening. The Valith dismissed it immediately. Talvex told his advisors that the humans were hiding like animals in a burrow, and that they would emerge eventually, broken and ready to accept whatever terms the Council imposed. He had seen it 100 times before, with 100 different species. But other species were not so sure. The Krellian Observatory, a neutral scientific body that monitored galactic communications, reported something unusual. Human ships were powering down across explored space, outposts and relay stations and research vessels, all of them going dark one by one, in a pattern that moved inward toward Earth like a wave retreating from the shore. It was not the random shutdown of a panicked civilization. It was organized and deliberate, and it followed a sequence that the Krellian analysts could not decode. The Rathani elder Sorath sat in his quarters on Aethara and stared at the data on his screen, and felt the cold hand of understanding close around his throat. He had studied human history more carefully than anyone else on the Council. He knew things about this species that the Valith had dismissed as irrelevant. He knew that humans had invented nuclear weapons and then spent 80 years choosing not to use them again. He knew that they had mapped their own genome and decided not to weaponize it. He knew that every generation of humans produced individuals who would walk into fire for strangers, and he knew that this restraint, this terrible, patient restraint, was not weakness. It was discipline. And discipline meant preparation. On Earth, the silence broke on the 4th day. President Alexander Osai stood before the United Earth Parliament in Geneva and addressed the species. His face was calm, and his voice was low and steady, and he spoke the way a surgeon speaks before making an incision, with precision and care, and no wasted words. He named every member of the delegation that had been killed. He said each name slowly and clearly, so that no one would forget. He named the scientists, and the artists, and the musicians, and the historians. And last of all, he named Elara Mwangi. And when he said her name, something shifted in the chamber, like the tectonic plates of a continent, grinding against each other far below the surface. We extended our hand, he said. They chose to cut it off. He paused. So be it. He told the Parliament and the world and the species that he was authorizing the activation of a contingency that had been built over 4 decades, since the very first day that human scientists had detected alien signals and realized that the galaxy was not a friendly place. The contingency had a name that had been chosen carefully by people who understood that words have weight. They called it the Destruction Protocol. It was not a weapon. It was not a fleet. It was not a bomb. It was something far worse. It was a plan, a detailed and methodical and ruthlessly engineered plan for the systematic dismantling of a galactic civilization's ability to function. It had been designed by the finest strategic minds on Earth over the course of 40 years, refined and updated and tested in simulations that no alien intelligence agency had ever detected. It had 7 stages. President Osei did not tell the world what the 7 stages were. He simply told them that the protocol was active, and that every human being would be called upon to play their part. He asked for no volunteers because he did not need them. Every man and woman and child on Earth already knew what they were willing to do. The transmission ended, and Earth's communications went dark again. Across the galaxy, the effect was immediate and unsettling. Every human ship in explored space had already powered down, but now the last traces of human presence vanished from the galactic network. Trade accounts were closed, diplomatic channels were severed, data archives were wiped. It was as if humanity had never existed, as if they had simply erased themselves from the galaxy and retreated into their own solar system to die quietly. The Thalith laughed. The rest of the galaxy did not. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a facility that did not appear on any map and had never been detected by any alien sensor, General Kira Tanaka sat in a command center, surrounded by screens that showed data streams from every corner of the galaxy. She was a small woman, with gray hair and steady hands. She had spent 30 years preparing for a day she had prayed would never come. She activated Stage 1. The designation for Stage 1 was cartography, and it was the reason that the destruction protocol was so terrifying. Not because of what it would do, but because of what it revealed about how long humanity had been preparing. 40 years ago, when the first alien signals had been detected, Earth's governments had made a secret decision. They would send probes into the galaxy, thousands of them, disguised as deep space survey instruments and scientific research packages. Each probe was small and quiet, and equipped with the most advanced stealth technology human engineers could build. They had been launched over the course of decades, scattered across the galaxy in patterns that looked random but were not. They were mapping everything. Every defense grid, every supply line, every shipyard and communication relay, and power station and military installation that the major galactic powers possessed. They had been watching and recording and storing data for 40 years, long before humanity had made official first contact, long before the outstretched hand had carried Ilara Mwangi to her death. The probes activated now, all of them at once, and the data poured into General Tanaka's command center like a river breaking through a dam. She saw the Valith hegemony laid bare before her. Every weakness and every vulnerability and every critical node in their vast and ancient empire. She studied the data and she felt nothing. There was no anger in her, and no hatred. There was only the cold, mechanical focus of a woman who had been given a job that needed to be done. She thought of Ilara Mwangi standing on that platform with her hands bound behind her back, speaking 7 words into the holocam. And she thought of the data crystal being crushed beneath a clawed foot. Every song and every story and every dream. Communicator, and spoke to the commanders of 700 stealth ships that had been hidden in deep space for over a decade, waiting for a signal that they hoped would never come. "Begin Stage 2, she said. Across the galaxy, in the dark spaces between stars, human ships stirred, like wolves waking in a forest. The Valith had no idea what was coming. No one did. On Ethara, Elder Sorath of the Rathani Collective sat alone in his quarters and poured himself a drink, with hands that would not stop shaking. He had tried to warn them. He had voted against the execution. He had told Talvex that this was a mistake, and the High Arbiter had looked at him with those copper eyes and smiled and said that humans were insects, and insects could be crushed. Sorath drank and stared at the dark screen where human signals used to be, and he whispered a prayer in a language that was older than the Council itself. He prayed for the Valith, because he knew that the Valith, humans, would not need prayers where they were going. 6 months after the execution of Ilara Mwangi, the Valith hegemony began to starve, and no one could explain why. It started on the agricultural worlds, 12 massive planets that the hegemony had terraformed over the course of millennia, to serve as the breadbasket of their empire. Each world was a masterpiece of automation, where enormous machines planted and harvested and processed and shipped food to 600 Valith colonies, without the need for a single living hand to touch the soil. The machines began to malfunction. It was subtle at first. A nutrient cycle there, adjusted by a fraction of a percent. A shipping manifest there rerouted to the wrong distribution center. A temperature control system on one greenhouse continent drifting half a degree warmer than it should have been. None of it looked deliberate. None of it triggered alarms. None of it seemed connected. But the effects compounded. Within 6 weeks, the agricultural output of the hegemony dropped by 15%. Within 8 weeks, it dropped by 30%. Cargo ships arrived at colony worlds, with holds full of grain that had spoiled in transit, or fertilizer that had been mixed in the wrong ratios, or seed stock that had been subtly altered to produce crops that looked healthy on the surface, but contained almost no nutritional value. The Valith investigated and found nothing. Their engineers ran diagnostics, their scientists tested samples, and their intelligence operatives scoured the networks for signs of sabotage. Every single one of them came to the same conclusion. It was a series of unfortunate system failures. Natural entropy in aging automated systems. Nothing more. They were wrong. Stage 2 of the destruction protocol was called famine, and it was a work of art that no gallery would ever display. Human cyber warfare units had embedded themselves in the galactic networks years before first contact, disguised as translation software patches, and communication protocol updates and routine maintenance packages. They had been sleeping in the hegemony systems like seeds buried in frozen ground, waiting for the signal to grow. Now they grew. General Tanaka monitored the operation from her command center beneath the earth and allowed herself the smallest fraction of satisfaction. Not because she enjoyed what she was doing, but because it was working exactly as designed. The protocol had been built on a single insight that separated human strategic thinking from every other species in the galaxy. The understanding that the most devastating weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that erodes. While the Valiths scrambled to fix their food supply, Stage 3 activated. Its name was Babel. The Galactic Council's Universal Translation Matrix was the single most important piece of technology in interstellar civilization. It allowed 4,000 species speaking 4,000 languages to communicate instantly and perfectly. It was the foundation upon which every treaty and trade agreement and diplomatic relationship in the galaxy was built. Human operatives began to corrupt it. The changes were infinitesimal, a word here translated with a slightly different connotation, a phrase there carrying an unintended implication. A tone of voice filtered through the matrix, emerging on the other side with a shade of aggression or contempt that the speaker had never intended. The results were catastrophic. Diplomatic incidents between Council species spiked by 300% in a single month. The Krellian delegation accused the Morvathi of insulting their territorial claims. The Morvathi accused the Krellian of threatening war. The Thessi Trade Federation withdrew from negotiations with the Pelori because a routine contract discussion had somehow devolved into a series of escalating insults that neither side had actually spoken. Old rivalries reignited. Species that had maintained fragile peace for centuries suddenly found themselves unable to communicate without giving offense. The council chamber became a shouting match, and Thalvek spent every waking hour trying to hold his coalition together, while his empire slowly starved in the background. Then came Stage 4. Its name was Whisper, and it was perhaps the cruelest stage of all. Intelligence packages began appearing on alien information networks, leaked documents and intercepted communications, and classified files that revealed the true history of Valith domination in the galaxy. Every species knew that the hegemony was powerful, but the leaked files showed exactly how that power had been maintained, through blackmail and assassination, and the manipulation of council votes for thousands of years. The documents showed that the Valith had engineered famines on rebellious worlds, centuries before humanity even existed. They showed that Thalvex's predecessors had arranged the destruction of 3 species that had grown too powerful to control. They showed that the vote to execute Ilaram Wangi had been secured not through legitimate debate, but through threats made in private to the delegations that voted in favor. The galaxy read, and the galaxy remembered. 3 species formally withdrew from the council. The Thessi Trade Federation announced that it would no longer honor economic agreements with the hegemony. The Pelori military alliance began repositioning its fleet away from Vilith borders, not in aggression, but in preparation for the possibility that the hegemony might lash out as it weakened. Elder Sorath of the Rathani Collective watched all of this from his quarters on Aethara and understood what was happening with a clarity that made his old heart ache. Humanity was not fighting a war. They were performing surgery, cutting away the connections that held the hegemony together, one strand at a time, with a precision that suggested they had been studying the patient for decades. He reached out to Earth through an old emergency channel that predated official first contact, a frequency that human scientists had used for deep space research before the outstretched hand had ever launched. He sent a message, asking for dialogue, begging for a chance to mediate, to find some path that did not end in the complete annihilation of a civilization. Earth responded. The response was a single line of text, transmitted without encryption, for anyone in the galaxy to intercept and read. You had your chance to speak, and you voted, and now you watch. Sorath read it, and closed his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. On Aethara, Thalvex sat in his private chamber and stared at the intelligence reports piling up on his desk, and finally allowed himself to feel the first cold tendril of fear. He had underestimated them. He had thought they were insects, small and fragile, and easily crushed. But insects did not do this. Insects did not dismantle empires through whispers and patience and surgical precision. He called his admirals, and gave the order that he believed would end this quietly and permanently. He would send the hegemony's war fleet, 10,000 ships of the line, the most powerful armada in the galaxy, to the human solar system. He would burn their little world to ash, and scatter the ash into the void. And then the whispers would stop, and the systems would be repaired, and everything would return to the way it had been for 200,000 years. The armada assembled above Aethara, a formation so vast it cast a shadow across the planet's surface. And then it jumped. 10,000 warships tore through FTL space toward the small yellow star that humanity called Sol. They arrived expecting resistance. They found nothing. The solar system was empty. No defense platforms orbited Earth. No fleet waited in formation behind Jupiter. Weapons batteries lined the asteroid belt. There was nothing but silence and starlight and the slow rotation of planets that seemed utterly unconcerned with the arrival of 10,000 instruments of destruction. The Valith admirals scanned and rescanned, and found no sign of human presence anywhere in the system. It was as if the entire species had simply left, packed their bags and vanished into the dark between the stars. Then a beacon activated. It was small, no larger than a human fist, and it floated in the empty space where Earth's largest orbital station had once been. It broadcast on every frequency in every known language, and the message it carried was a recording. Ilaram Wangi's voice filled the bridge of every Valith warship, calm and clear and final. Earth will remember what you did here. The recording played on loop 7 times, and then the beacon self-destructed. In the silence that followed, every ship in the Valith Armada received a simultaneous transmission, not from the beacon, but from somewhere far away. The transmission was a live feed showing real-time images of a world that every Valith officer recognized instantly. It was Verith Prime, their home, and something was happening to it. The trap had been perfect in its simplicity. While the Valith armada burned its way toward an empty solar system, while 10,000 warships pointed their weapons at a planet that no longer needed defending, humanity executed the real strike behind them. Stage 5 was called Eclipse, and it began at exactly the same moment across every system the Valith hegemony controlled. Thousands of stealth ships emerged from hiding positions they had occupied for years. Some had been drifting in the debris fields of asteroid belts, disguised as dead rock. Others had been parked in the shadow of gas giants running so cold that their hulls were indistinguishable from the void itself. Others still had been sitting inside the sensor blind spots that the Stage 1 probes had identified years ago. Pockets of space where the hegemony's detection grids could not reach because no one had ever bothered to look. Each ship was small, no larger than a standard shuttle, and each one carried a single weapon. A gravitational resonance disruptor was not a bomb, and it was not a laser, and it was not anything that the galaxy had ever seen before. It was a device that generated a focused pulse of gravitational interference, capable of tearing apart complex machinery at the molecular level, while leaving biological matter and simple structures completely untouched. It was a weapon designed not to kill, but to erase the concept of technology from a civilization. The stealth ships fired. In a single coordinated hour that would later be called the longest hour by every species in the galaxy, the entire technological infrastructure of the Valith hegemony ceased to exist. On Verith Prime, the orbital defense platforms that had guarded the homeworld for 50,000 years twisted and buckled and came apart like sculptures made of sand, hit by a wave. The great shipyards that had built the mightiest fleet in galactic history crumbled into clouds of drifting metal. The communication arrays that connected Verith Prime to 600 colony worlds went dark one by one, like candles being snuffed out in a cathedral. On the colony worlds, the story was the same. FTL gates, the massive ring-shaped structures that allowed ships to jump between star systems, shattered in their orbits. Power stations that drew energy from the cores of gas giants collapsed into themselves. Automated factories that had produced warships and weapons for millennia ground to a halt as their internal mechanisms dissolved into useless dust. Not a single city was touched. Not a single home was damaged. Not a single Valith citizen was harmed. Humanity had reached into the hegemony's chest and removed its heart with the precision of a surgeon who had spent 40 years studying the patient's anatomy. The Valith were alive, every single one of them, but the civilization they had built over 200,000 years was gone. Stage 6 activated. Immediately after Eclipse, and its name was Stone Age. Without FTL communication, the hegemony's 600 worlds were suddenly and completely isolated. Each colony existed alone, cut off from every other colony and from the homeworld, with no way to send a message and no way to receive one. The interstellar empire that had dominated the galaxy since before humans had learned to make fire was reduced in a single day to 600 separate planets that could not talk to each other. The Valith Armada, floating above the empty solar system of Sol, received the live feed of their homeworld's infrastructure disintegrating, and the bridges of 10,000 warships filled with sounds that no human ear had ever heard. The keening wail of Valith officers watching everything they had ever known come apart like a dream dissolving in the morning light. Admiral Korath, the fleet commander, screamed orders to jump back to Verith Prime, but the jump gates were gone. The FTL beacons, that guided long-range navigation, were gone. The fuel depots that the fleet would need to cross the vast distance between Sol and Valith space under conventional drive were gone. The Armada was stranded. 10,000 warships carrying 2 million Valith soldiers, floating in the empty space of an alien solar system, with no way home. The silence on the bridges lasted a long time. Then a transmission cut through it, not from the dead beacon, and not from the stealth ships, but from Earth itself. The planet was still there, of course. Humanity had never left. They had simply moved underground, and into the deep ocean habitats, and into the orbital stations hidden in the outer system. They had made themselves invisible, and let the Valith come to them, like a matador stepping aside at the last moment to let the bull charge past into empty air. President Alexander Osei's face appeared on every screen in the Valith fleet, and his expression was not triumphant, gloating or cruel or satisfied. It was tired and sad and old in a way that had nothing to do with age. "We do not want your lives," he said. "We want you to live long enough to understand what you lost and why." He offered terms: unconditional surrender, permanent disarmament. The Valith fleet would power down its weapons and submit to human escort ships that would transport them home to Verath Prime, to a homeworld that still had air and water and food and shelter, but no longer had anything that could reach the stars. Those who refused would not be fired upon. They would simply be left where they were, drifting in Sol's outer system with enough supplies to survive, but no way to go anywhere. Ships without a destination, soldiers without a war. Admiral Korath stood on his bridge and looked at the face of the human president, and felt something he had never felt in 300 years of military service. He felt small. 2 weeks. Human ships moved through the Valith fleet with calm efficiency, collecting weapons and drive cores and navigation systems. The Valith soldiers stood in the corridors of their own ships and watched humans walk past them, small, soft creatures with no claws and no scales and no natural armor. And they could not understand how this had happened. How had these fragile beings dismantled the most powerful empire in the galaxy without ever firing a shot in anger? The transport back to Verath Prime took 3 months at sublight speed, and it was the longest 3 months in Valith history. The soldiers sat in human transport ships, and ate human food, and breathed human-filtered air, and some of them wept, and some of them raged, and some of them simply stared at the walls and tried to comprehend the scale of what had been done to them. When they arrived at Verath Prime, they found their world intact. The cities stood, the oceans flowed, the forests that covered the southern continent still swayed in the wind. But the sky was empty. No orbital rings, no shipyards, no defense platforms, no communication arrays. Nothing but clouds and stars and the terrible silence of a world that had been cut off from the universe. The Valith had not been killed. They had been forgotten. And across the galaxy, every other species watched in absolute breathless terror, because they understood what humanity had demonstrated. It was not military power, and it was not technological superiority, and it was not even the terrifying patience that had allowed them to prepare for 40 years in secret. It was the fact that humanity had possessed the ability to do so much worse, and had chosen not to. In her command center beneath the earth, General Tanaka filed her final report, and transmitted it to President Osei. 6 stages complete. All objectives achieved. 0 civilian casualties, 0 military casualties on either side. The Valith hegemony had been reduced from the dominant power in the galaxy to a pre-spaceflight civilization in 182 days. Osei read the report and then asked about Stage 7. Tanaka was quiet for a moment, then she told him the truth. Stage 7 had always been theoretical. It was the final option, the one that would only be used if all other stages failed. Its designation was Scorched Earth, and its purpose was total biosphere annihilation of the target civilization, not infrastructure, not technology, life itself. It had never been intended to be used. It existed only as a reminder to the people who built the protocol that there was a line they must never cross, a depth to which they must never sink, no matter what was done to them. Osei stared at the file on his screen for a long time. Then he ordered it sealed permanently, encrypted with a key that would be destroyed and buried in a vault that would be filled with concrete and forgotten. "We are not them," he said, quietly. "That is the point." Tanaka nodded and closed the file, and the screen went dark. Somewhere far away, on a world with empty skies, a Valith child looked up and asked her mother where the lights had gone, the bright moving lights that used to cross the darkness every night like a river of silver. Her mother had no answer. The lights were gone, and they were not coming back. 2 years after the execution of Ilaram Wangi, the galaxy looked like a different place. The Galactic Council was gone, dissolved not by force, but by the slow collapse of the structure that had held it together for 200,000 years. Without the Valith hegemony's iron grip, the coalition had fractured along lines that had always existed, but had been held in place by fear and economic pressure. Species that had been loyal to the Council out of survival rather than conviction drifted away quietly, like guests leaving a party when the host falls asleep. In the vacuum that remained, humanity made an offer that no one expected. President Osei stood before a gathering of representatives from over 2,000 species, held not on the ruins of Aethara, but on a newly constructed station, orbiting a neutral star in unclaimed space. And he proposed the creation of a new governing body. He called it the Galactic Accord, and its founding principles were so simple that many of the older species assumed there must be a trick hidden somewhere beneath the words. Mutual sovereignty, every species governs itself without interference. Non-aggression, disputes are resolved through mediation, not military force. Open trade, economic barriers between willing partners are removed. Voluntary membership, no species is compelled to join, and any species may leave at any time. The terms were generous, almost suspiciously tenuous. The galaxy had just watched humanity dismantle the most powerful empire in known history without killing a single person, and now the same species was offering to share power equally with civilizations that could not have resisted them if they tried. Some species joined immediately, particularly those that had suffered under Valith domination for centuries. The Thessi Trade Federation signed on within hours, eager to rebuild their economic networks without the hegemony's crushing tariffs. Alliance joined because they recognized strength when they saw it, and preferred to stand beside it rather than in front of it. Others joined more slowly, driven not by enthusiasm, but by the quiet understanding that a species capable of what humanity had done was a species you wanted as a friend and not as a stranger. A few refused and retreated into isolation, fortifying their borders and watching the stars with suspicious eyes. Humanity did not pursue them, did not threaten them, did not even acknowledge their absence publicly. When asked about the holdouts, President Osei simply said that the door was open and would remain open for as long as it needed to. The Rathani Collective was the first species to formally request an alliance with Earth. Elder Sorath traveled to the news station personally, old and tired, and carrying the weight of a guilt that had aged him more in 2 years than the previous century had. He stood before the human delegation and delivered a public apology that was broadcast across the galaxy. He spoke of the vote. He spoke of how he had argued against the execution, and how his arguments had failed. He spoke of the moment he had watched Ilara die on the holocam feed, and how he had known, with the certainty of a man watching a lit match fall into dry grass, that the galaxy would burn for what had been done that day. He did not make excuses. He did not claim that his vote against the execution absolved him of responsibility. He said that he had been part of a system that allowed such a thing to happen, and that made him complicit, regardless of which way he had raised his hand. The human delegation listened, and when he finished, a woman stood. She was tall, with dark skin and steady eyes, and she extended her hand in the human gesture of friendship. "We accept your apology," she said, "not because it erases what happened, but because it proves that you understand why it should never happen again." And the holocams captured the moment, and across the galaxy something shifted. Not a political shift, and not a military shift, but something deeper. A crack in the wall of suspicion that separated species that had spent millennia treating each other as threats rather than neighbors. On the anniversary of Alara's death, Earth unveiled the Mwangi Memorial. It was a massive orbital station, positioned at the exact coordinates in space where the outstretched hand had been seized by Council security forces 2 years earlier. The station was beautiful, a structure of glass and light and growing things with gardens that contained plants from every human continent, and halls designed for species of every size and shape. It served 3 purposes. First, it was a neutral diplomatic ground, a place where any species could meet and talk and negotiate without the shadow of any single power hanging over them. Second, it was a cultural exchange hub, a living archive of art and music and literature from every species that chose to contribute, open to anyone who wished to learn about the beings they shared the galaxy with. Third, it was a memorial. Alara Mwangi's final words were engraved on the station's outer hull in every known galactic language, all 4,000 of them. The letters caught the light of distant stars and blazed like fire against the darkness, and every ship that passed the station could read them. "Earth will remember what you did here, P." But the words were not a threat anymore. They were a promise that the sacrifice would not be forgotten, and that the galaxy it had helped create would be worthy of the price that had been paid. 6 months after the memorial's unveiling, a young Valith historian named Sethara was working in the ruins of her species' great archive on Varith Prime. The building still stood, but its digital systems were destroyed, and she was reduced to sorting through physical records that had been printed as backups centuries ago. Documents that no one had ever expected to need again. She found something that stopped her cold. The data crystal that Thalvex had crushed, the one containing humanity's complete cultural archive, had not been the only copy. Before the outstretched hand had ever reached Athara, Alara Mwangi had quietly distributed fragments of the archive to dozens of smaller species. Copies of human music had been given to the Rathani. Collections of human art had been shared with the Fessi. Recordings of human stories and histories and scientific discoveries had been scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown into the wind by a gardener who knew that a storm was coming. Alara had planned for the possibility of her own death. She had known, perhaps not with certainty, but with the quiet understanding of a woman who had studied the galaxy carefully enough to see its teeth behind its smile, that the Council might reject her offer, had known that the crystal might be destroyed, and so she had made sure that the things it contained would survive, even if she did not. The music lived, the art lived, the stories lived. Sethara sat in the ruins of her civilization's greatest library, surrounded by the dust of a fallen empire, and she wept, not for the Valith, but for the woman who had walked into the mouth of the beast, carrying nothing but a gift, and the desperate hope that it would be received with kindness. She wrote a paper. It was translated into every language in the galaxy, and it was read by billions of beings on thousands of worlds. And its conclusion was a single paragraph that would be quoted for centuries to come. "They came to us with everything they were, and we destroyed it. They could have destroyed everything we were in return. Instead, they left us alive and offered us a second chance. I do not know what to call this. The humans have a word for it. They call it mercy." Reached Earth, and it was read aloud in the Parliament, and strong men and women wept openly at the words, because mercy had not been easy. It had been the hardest thing they had ever done, harder than building the protocol, harder than watching Alara die, harder than dismantling an empire. The hardest thing was choosing to stop. On the first anniversary of the Galactic Accord, Elder Sorath visited the Mwangi Memorial to pay his respects. He walked through the gardens and the galleries, and he stopped at a window that looked out into the endless dark of space. A small human girl was standing there, perhaps 8 years old, with her palm pressed flat against the glass. Her eyes were wide and dark, and filled with starlight, and she was staring out at the galaxy with an expression that Sorath could not quite name. It was not wonder exactly, and it was not sadness. It was something in between, the look of someone who knows that the world is vast and terrible and beautiful all at once. "What are you looking at?" he asked gently. The girl turned and smiled at him, and the smile was so bright and so free of fear that it made his old heart crack. "My grandmother told me that if you are kind enough and strong enough, you never have to be cruel," she said. Sorath knelt, so that his eyes were level with hers. "Who was your grandmother?" he asked. The girl's smile did not waver. "Her name was Alara," she said. Sorath closed his eyes and felt something ancient and heavy fall away from him, a weight he had been carrying for 2 years that he had not known how to put down. The guilt and the grief and the shame, all of it released like a breath held too long. When he opened his eyes, the girl was gone, vanished back into the gardens to chase some butterfly or follow some sound that only young ears could hear. And he was alone at the window with the stars. He pressed his own hand against the glass where hers had been, and the surface was still warm. Outside the stars burned on, ancient and indifferent and eternal. They did not care about empires or councils or the small, fragile creatures that lived and died in their light. They had seen civilizations rise and fall 1,000,000 times, and they would see 1,000,000 more. But among them now, something new moved. Not an empire built on fear, and not a hegemony maintained by force, and not a fleet of warships carrying the promise of destruction. It was a covenant, fragile and imperfect, and held together by nothing stronger than the choice to be kind in a galaxy that had given every reason not to be. It was human, and it was enough.